James, honey, did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
Maria?
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
So, you're Maria?
I am. If you want me to be.
All I want from you is an answer.
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real.
They say every villain is a hero in their own story. And to an extent, that is true. But for Silent Hill 2, that term has been switched around on its head. Except there are no heroes in this story. The game of Silent Hill 2 is a harrowing tale about depression, grief, self-destruction, and denial, all wrapped up into the head of our protagonist, James Sunderland. James worked as a clerk for a small company operating in South Ashfield. He comes from a military family, while not serving himself, and is fairly distant from his family. Eventually, James meets Mary at a mutual friend's house party. They connected, and began seeing each other rather frequently, which leads to them eventually getting married. They held a very strong and peaceful relationship. On one fateful vacation, James takes Mary to the resort town of Silent Hill. It was a very beautiful place, a sacred place. Mary made James promise to take her there again someday.
It's too bad we have to leave. Please promise you'll take me again, James.
But he never did. Prior to the events of the game, Mary dies of an unknown terminal illness. The years leading up to this death were full of pain for both Mary and James. Mary went through violent mood swings and depression, but James, he went through the worst.
You're a doctor. It's your job to heal people. How can you just let her die?
Please, calm down. As her doctor, I promise I'll do what I can. But there's still no effective treatment for her condition.
How long does she have?
I'm afraid I'm not sure. 3 years at most. Perhaps 6 months. It's impossible to say with certainty.
He tried everything. Everything he could have ever thought of doing to save Mary. But alas, his efforts were in vain. He began to drink due to loneliness, visiting Mary less and less due to her volatile behavior.
Mary?
What do you want, James?
I brought you some flowers.
Flowers? I don't want any damn flowers. Just go home already.
Mary, what are you saying?
Look, I'm disgusting. I don't deserve flowers. Between the disease and the drugs, I look like a monster. Well, what are you looking at? Get the hell out of here! Leave me alone already! I'm no use to anyone. I'll be dead soon anyway. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. It'd be easier if they'd just kill me. But I guess the hospital is making a nice profit off me. They want to keep me alive. Are you still here? I told you to go. Are you deaf? Don't come back. James, wait. Please don't go. Stay with me. Don't leave me alone. I didn't mean what I said. Please, James. Tell me I'll be okay. Tell me I'm not going to die. Help me.
He felt bouts of sexual frustration, leading him to sometimes seeing his wife as a burden. But despite this, he did still love her. And as Mary begins to get sicker and sicker, James eventually snaps. He visits Mary in the hospital one last time, kisses her goodbye, and then suffocates her with a pillow. He then takes her body with him, leaving her in the back seat, and drives to Silent Hill. As the player, we don't know that Mary was killed by James until much later in the game. It's even implied that James himself doesn't know, as if he forgot or pushed the entire event out of his mind. The game starts with James getting a letter from Mary long after she's dead. The letter states that she's waiting for him in Silent Hill, waiting in their special place. He knows she's dead and doesn't know why he's looking for her, but regardless, he does. Near the end of the game, the player can discover that the letter in James's inventory is now just a blank piece of paper, further establishing the delusions James is facing. The events of this game are not clear if they take place in reality or a self-punishing dream, as when James enters the town of Silent Hill, he comes across things that are beyond belief. The once beautiful resort town is abandoned, soaked with dewy fog that covers the entire town like a blanket. Roaming the town are monsters that only James can see. Monsters that represent his deepest feelings and fears. If you look closely, all the monsters James will face are female and somewhat sexualized. Except for one. That one monster, which was named by the fans as Pyramid Head, is a pursuer that cannot be stopped, and seems only to be in existence to punish James. While in the town, James comes across other characters who seem to be fighting their own demons. Characters that we don't know if they're real or not, part of James's delusions, or if they're real people just fighting their own problems. But there is one person we can say without a doubt that is a part of James's story, and his alone.
Mary? No, you're not.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
No, my late wife. I can't believe it. You could be her twin. Your face, your voice, just your hair and clothes are different.
My name is Maria. I don't look like a ghost, do I?
Maria is not unlike the traditional doppelganger from classic folklore. She's depicted as more suggestive and seductive than Mary, often trying to convince James to forget about her. Maria is a manifestation of what James always wanted from his wife. Someone who was more energetic, assertive, and sexually extroverted, something that Mary was not. It's as if she's a evil twin, as it were, to further tempt James into fracturing himself. Upon playing the game, James is evidently an odd fellow from the way he talks to the way he walks. He's described as kind and even a bit surly, not being much of a talker. He's typically courteous to other characters, showing concern and sometimes even a little temper. However, James is deeply affected by the loss of confidence and depression from the passing of his late wife. He refuses to accept any part of her death, believing she died from illness. He can be perceived initially as a coward, running away from guilt. When he finds himself confronted with the truth, he'll often avert his eyes, avoid eye contact, or fall silent. James is also borderline suicidal. In the novelization, he says, "Actually, I guess I am dead. Heart's as good as dead anyway," highlighting his sense of loss. As a result, he tends to be rather reckless, leading him to do questionable things. For example, jumping down dark, seemingly deep pits, fishing around dirty toilets without hesitation, leaving his car door open at the beginning of the game, or plunging his hand into a dark hole a second time after previously being pricked by something. Regarding an assessment into Mr. Sunderland, there are many paths that we could take. For example, we could institute the Minnesota Multifacet Personality Inventory, or the MMPI-2. Or, as a different route, we can also take the Multiscale Dissociation Inventory Assessment. First off, let's address my reasoning for the MMPI-2. The MMPI-2 is the granddaddy of all personality tests, being fairly old and still important in its use. It can be used to diagnose emotional disorders such as depression and major patterns of personality. The reason why this test would be a good fit for James is that he's recently gone through traumatic events, that being the death of his wife. It would be able to determine his emotional responses to these events and place into question some of his odd quirks. For James, the scales that we want to look at are Scale 8, aka the Schizophrenia Scale, which measures a person's unusual or odd cognitive, perceptual, and emotional experiences. The reason for this would be because of the odd things that James sees, whether we don't know if they're real or not, and for some of the odd things that James finds himself doing, although some of these things could be related to suicidal tendencies. The second scale we want to look at is the Depression Scale, measuring a person's depressive symptoms, as James is not only depressed but is acting out in unusual ways. For example, one might say that putting your dead wife's body in the backseat of your car is a very odd reaction to just murdering her. Or, well, putting her out of her misery in whichever way you want to look at it. However, the MMPI-2 is dichotomous, which means it's a true or false test, with 567 items, which could take up to 1 to 2 hours to complete. There is a chance the patient could check out or not answer truthfully. However, we can assume that this person taking the test would want to be seeking assistance and answer as truthfully as possible. The second test worth implementing is the Multiscale Dissociation Inventory Assessment, as throughout the game, James can be perceived as disassociating from his own reality. The purpose of the NDI is to measure 6 different types of dissociative responses, those being disengagement, depersonalization, derealization, emotional constriction/numbing, memory disturbance, and identity dissociation. The MDI takes approximately 10 to 15 minutes to complete for all but the most clinically impaired individuals, and usually can be scored and profiled in less than 5 minutes. When it comes to James and the scales that he could register on, I think some important ones would be derealization, as James often claims is that he feels as if he's in a dream, wondering if the events around him are real. However, this one can be ignored for the most part, as we ourselves, as the player, don't really know if this is real, so we can't really fully determine this. Emotional constriction/numbing would be a factor, as we believe most of James's issues are rooted in PTSD, leading to this horrible nightmare he finds himself in, and being the root of most of his issues. However, the most important factor that we can get from this is memory disturbance, as this is definitely a part of James's issues. In fact, we don't find out till much later in the game that James murdered his wife, and he blocked out the memory of it. These are telltale signs of dissociative amnesia, which occurs when a person blocks out certain information often associated with stressful or traumatic events. And with those two assessments completed, either in conjunction with each other or separately, we can determine a proper diagnosis for James Sunderland. James Sunderland can be diagnosed with a multitude of issues and problems. However, on the surface level, a more observable level, we could diagnose James with depression. For those who are unfamiliar, depression is the presence of a sad, empty, or irritable mood, accompanied by somatic and cognitive changes that significantly affect the individual's capacity to function. Feelings of worthlessness, or excessive or inappropriate guilt. And they would be suffering from these problems nearly every day. These issues may or may not be delusional, and not merely self-reproach or guilt about being sick. For example, depression is similarly double-sided of those who suffer depressive symptoms. Those often describe themselves as feeling numb and empty like hollow shells or tin men. Some describe depression as the overwhelming feeling of anxiety, pain, and self-hatred. However, in the case of James Sunderland, he feels loneliness, guilt, and self-loathing. And all of this due to the terminal illness that his wife was going through. James feels total emptiness after his wife's death. The monsters that James will fight represent these feelings, the loneliness, the guilt, all of it, all against James, weighing him down and chasing him until he is dead. James Sunderland may also be perceived as being a sufferer of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD can evolve from directly experiencing a traumatic event, or from witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others. PTSD is persistent or recurrent experiences of feeling detached from oneself, as if one were an outside observer of one's mental processes or body. For example, feeling as if one were in a dream, feeling a sense of unreality, of self or body, or of time moving slowly. In James's case, persistent or recurrent experiences of unrealistic surroundings. For example, the world around the individual experiences unreal, dreamlike, or distorted. James Sunderland is actually involved in his wife's death. The guilt he has disturbed James heavily. James is coping with PTSD, only with a horror element attached because of the exaggerated, grotesque world around him. The monsters he fights are symbolism. Symbolism for all the crippling ideas within his head that he must fight back against. James's mind creates a physical world for him to deal with this post-traumatic stress disorder. The obstacles presented had two choices: either take them on or find a way around them. James's PTSD symptoms have caused a world of horror. It is inescapable to him because of the trauma he went through. It is inescapable to everyone within it. And as an addendum, the dissociative amnesia could be a factor into this PTSD as a symptom, as he forgot the so-called traumatic event, or rather his involvement with it. In the game, we see that Sunderland loses his confidence and self-respect when his wife Mary became ill, later progressing to the deep depression after her passing. He lost confidence because he felt impotent when it came to curing Mary from the disease that took 3 years of their lives, and he admits that he hates her and resents her for it. James is broken in the game's beginning. The wasting away of his wife took a toll on him. It has given him grief and anger with himself and the world. for his lot in life. It could even be that he felt disappointed in himself for feeling sexually frustrated, knowing that Mary was sick. Sunderland tried and successfully convinced himself that Mary died of illness alone as a coat for his guilt. He refused to accept that he played any part of Mary's passing and the monsters that he faces. They're a constant reminder of this act. The loss of a loved one can easily cause development of depression. The setting of the game itself is intense, and the environment Sunderland ongoingly finds himself in is dark, gloomy, and gives off a haunting feeling. As for the PTSD that James suffers, that came from killing his wife. Sunderland witnesses his wife's slow death and suffers from the guilt, coupled with his involvement in her assisted suicide, which left James greatly disturbed. Much of the events of the game involved James effectively coping with PTSD, only with a horror element attached because of the exaggerated, grotesque world around him. Everything from the monsters to the symbolism is James' fractured psychology, wrestling with his desire to not only let go, but to not remember what he did. And it can lead to different paths that can make James even more tragic, if played that way. Apart from what James experienced with his wife, we know that he comes from a military family. In recent studies, it has been found that there is evidence that PTSD can be genetically inherited. Studies state that people with higher genetic risk of mental disorders such as schizophrenia and depression are at a higher risk of developing PTSD. So family in this case can be a factor in these problems. And now for the final part of our presentation, and potentially the most controversial part of this video, so I'm excited for that. Our first step towards James's therapy is to get him into behavioral therapy as soon as possible. Medication would unfortunately have to be our next step, but let's take this one at a time. The first method I would like to use is cognitive behavioral therapy, otherwise known as CBT. CBT focuses on challenging and changing unhelpful cognitive distortions and behavior, improving emotional regulation, which in James's case would be beneficial, as he needs someone there to question his actions and sway him away from the unhealthy and unsanitary actions that he likes to commit. Or otherwise known as talk therapy, would also be an option, particularly with a psychotherapist who specializes in depression. The next step, should we need to move to that step, would involve pills or medicine. We suggest using SSRIs in James's case, as it would be a good way to treat depression and also not harm him due to his known alcoholism, as explained earlier in the video. Antipsychotics may also be a good thing to include in James's repertoire to combat all those monsters he's been known to see, or anyone that looks a little too similar to his wife. Joking aside, antipsychotics are a good aid in symptoms of depression. However, due to his suicidal tendencies, taking medicine may not be the best choice for James, as an overdose could potentially occur. Finally, the last step we would have to take, being all that previous steps were a failure and James found himself going down a deeper hole, then he would find himself in the midst of a medical procedure. Most particularly in this case, electroconvulsive therapy. However, this is for the most extreme case and would be more than likely to combat his unusualness and help reorganize his cognitive distortions. This, however, is the most extreme case and would not be the ideal method, as it would possibly cause irreparable damage to James's mind. We suggest using other therapies, like cognitive behavioral therapy, as explained prior. Another good therapy to add to that list would be eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is an aid from a therapist by reconnecting the trauma to an individual in a safe, gradual, and measured way by doing such rudimentary movements as hand tapping or moving your eyes side to side. In James's case, overall, if things go according to this treatment plan, gradually James would be able to move past all of his trauma, at least hopefully, and move on. If only, right? If only.